KC. It is a privilege to have you on board. This is the first time I've ever done YouTube Live, so this may be just as sloppy as the mock draft, but I'm trying some new things, so of course those things are going to be very sloppy as I start doing them. Thank you for watching. I'll probably do this for, I don't know, 30 minutes or so, depending on how many people we actually get watching. If nobody watches, then I'll just stop and we'll hit the record button, and we'll post this thing up on YouTube like I normally do. So mainly tonight, I want to talk about the Kansas City Chiefs draft. And then if anybody else drops in on the live video, we will talk anything on the NFL draft or anything NFL-wise that you want to talk about. Or if you want to talk about something else, we'll talk about that too. But I am going to focus tonight on the Kansas City Chiefs, and we'll work our way through it. It's just straight up reaction. It's not super analytical or anything like that. It's just, hey, here's first impulse, first reaction kind of stuff. So that's really what we're looking at here tonight. And I may even stop for a couple of seconds and do a couple of things. But that's kind of what we're doing. So appreciate you being with us. And I'm trying to look up something else. And my technology is not wanting to cooperate the way I would like for it to. So hang on with me for just a second here. All right, well, anyway, we'll keep pushing on this thing. Trying to do two different things at the same time. Anyway, let's look at the Kansas City Chiefs tonight for what they were doing. 7-round draft picks. Let's go over here to teams. I'm on ESPN. Teams, Kansas City. If you happen to be watching me live and I'm ignoring the comments, it's just because I don't see them. This is, again, first time I'm ever doing this live. So, all right, let's start off at the top. Kansas City Chiefs went with Xavier Worthy in the first round. I think this surprised a lot of people. It surprised me. And I know a lot of you Kansas City fans were really looking forward to Kansas City actually doing a tackle in the first round. And I would have had no problem with that. I mean, absolutely zero problem. The only caveat I would add in with that is I would really have liked for it to be, and I got a thumbs up, so thank you. Whoever's watching, please, if you want to comment somehow, I will try to see if I can. If I can get you on live, that's fine too. But what I did notice out of the tackles this year, there were a lot of excellent tackles to choose from and look at, but really I thought the top 5 guys were the ones that were kind of ready-made very well. So you really want to get a guy that's kind of ready-made. And if the Chiefs were going to trade up to get a tackle, I would have liked for them to get a guy who was ready-made. So it would have been one of those higher-end tackles. They ended up not doing that, and that's fine because it's expensive. I mean, man, when you're sitting there at 32 and you're needing to move up all the way to 16 to get one of those legit tackles, right? Not just a project guy, but one of those legit guys. It is expensive. So you don't, I get Kansas City not wanting to do that. I get most teams not wanting to do that. All right, Dan Thompson, brother S&M, great to see you. Dan, I actually saw a comment. I don't know how I saw a comment because it's my first time on YouTube Live, but I appreciate the shout out, brother. I appreciate you watching. So let me know what y'all think about the Kansas City draft. I am more than happy. All the comments that I see while I'm looking here, I will respond to them. So anyway, shock of the night, I thought, for Kansas City anyway, was that they traded up a little bit to 28, I think, with the Bills to get Xavier Worthy. And I really liked that. Now, were there other wide receivers they could have gotten? Absolutely. Absolutely there were other guys. And could they have waited till the second round and got a wide receiver? Absolutely. There were several different ways to slice up this pie. There were several different ways. But the way that Kansas City ended up doing was looking at it as if Xavier Worthy is just super fast, and we want to hook him up with Patrick Mahomes, and we want to unleash the Mahomes beast that is throwing deep. And so that was the thing that I really did like. We can argue all night about whether or not it's worth the trade, because you do kind of get yourself out of a draft pool that is in the in the third round there from 95 back to 122. You're getting out of there, and that's kind of a drop off right there. And there were other guys they could have drafted, and they could have gone and got a tackle. But picking up Xavier Worthy, at least in theory, the hope is that super deep speed unlocks the potential that is Patrick Mahomes. And so that I liked, and that was one reason why I was encouraging Kansas City to get not one but 2 wide receivers in this year's draft, which they didn't do. They ended up only getting the one, and I'm not necessarily counting the tight end. They only got the one, but Xavier Worthy with that deep speed unlocks it, because you got by with it for 1 year. You won a Super Bowl, but I didn't want to see the Chiefs continuing to do that every year. Patrick Mahomes not being able to do his full potential, his MVP caliber thing. So I liked that, even though it did cost them, and even though there are no guarantees that Xavier Worthy is going to be any better of a wide receiver than some of the other guys we've seen, I ultimately liked it. I liked the aggressiveness. I liked the intelligent aggressiveness. So that's where I'm at on that. You get to the second round here, Kingsley Suamataia. You know, Suamataia is an interesting guy because if you look back over the draft boards, say over the past 4 or 5 months from the late college season all the way through the draft process, there were people who had him as high as late first round, and then there were people that had him back in the third round. So all over the board what people actually thought of him. And again, I'm a little worried about the Chiefs being able to develop a tackle. That does worry me. But you can't give up. You can't stop drafting tackles when it's there, and Suamataia was the guy that was there. So sitting there in the late second round, all things considered, late second round for Suamataia to still be sitting there, I was actually pretty excited they got him. Now, would I have been a lot more excited if they had paid a king's ransom and gotten Joe Alt? Yeah. Joe Alt would have been the be-all, end-all, right? I would have loved that. Would I have been more excited if they had maybe traded up to 16, 15, somewhere in there, and been able to get Fatanu out of Washington? Yeah, I would have liked that too. But seeing as how they were sitting back there at the end of the second round and Suamataia is still sitting there, I was pretty excited about that. So we'll talk more about that in a second. Dan chimes in here. I think balancing improvement this year and not handicapping us in the future makes this an A draft. So Dan actually loves the fact that we did improve, because by all markers, it looks like the Chiefs got better, right? Not worse after the draft. They got better. They added the deep threat. They added a tackle. We'll see what else they added. And that's a great point, and one that I think teams like the Chiefs love to stick with. They really don't like to give up future draft picks unless they find that absolutely necessary. In fact, they kind of like to add draft picks. We saw that when Tyreek Hill got traded a year or two ago, 2 seasons ago now, I guess it is. So Dan, it's a great point. Not handicapping teams in the future, yourself in the future. I get that. So I'm all in for that. And they didn't, They gave up a draft pick this year. They kind of sort of swapped, really. They were able to catch up at 133, right, and get that extra fourth. So it's a great point there that they didn't handicap themselves in the future. Everything's still out there for next year and the year after. And I totally agree with that. So again, do I have questions about Kansas City's ability to develop tackles? I do. But again, you got to do something there at tackle. They didn't really have the starting tackle for this season on board. So they went with Suamataia, and I was actually pretty excited about that. So top 2 picks, we could argue a lot about were they the right things to do, but I really liked that they hit what probably was their 2 biggest positions of need. One with super speed potential to hook up, kind of double charge with Mahomes deep, and the other, hopefully, maybe in theory, if all goes right, maybe Suamataia is your starter for the next decade, right? And when you draft a guy in the second round, you have a reason to think that, whether or not it pans out, you have a reason to think that. So Suamataia, second round draft pick, I actually like that. Now, here's the curious thing. No third round pick. This is true in every draft, but I think it's becoming more true than ever now because of NIL money that's just starting to have an impact. And the point is this: when you get from, say, early 4th round, that's usually about where the cutoff is, those top 100, 120 players, when you get out of the top 120 players and down into, say, mid-5th round, there's a massive drop-off, a massive step down in what you expect to get out of future starters, future stars, speed, athleticism, you name it, across the board. It's a major drop-off. Now, my thought is, looking at this year's draft, and I've been looking at this year's draft ever since the last draft ended. We've got all these mock draft simulators out here, which is great, and we've got more more info available than ever on the internet, which is great for guys like me who literally come Monday night, I'll be looking at next year's draft class. So my thought is, once you got outside of the top 90 or 100 picks this year, there was a huge drop off right there in this year's draft. So for Kansas City to trade out of 95, there was a little bit of cost there because you get back to 133 and it just wasn't the same caliber of players anymore that you had at 95. Now, Kansas City didn't seem worried about that because, again, they're looking at who they can get here in the first round and who they can hook up with Mahomes. So I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying that there was a trade-off, and that trade-off I think is going to be even more stark in years to come because guys that used to be sitting there in the fourth round of the NFL draft, these days they are actually staying in college because they can make $500,000 a year or $1 million a year, or depending on what position they play, they might be making $1 million a year driving a car I could never afford and still just hanging out in college and, living life large, right? So there were a number of guys this year, and there always are, but it was a more noticeable number of bigger names this year who knew that they weren't going to get drafted in the top 2 or 3 rounds this year, and they just went right back to college. And they got NIL deals set up. They're at major colleges. They're going to have major tape next year. And next year, some of them are wide receivers and quarterbacks. They're not going to be fighting as deep of a class. So, that's what you're going to kind of have this year. And I think every year moving forward is those top 3 rounds, 2 to 3 rounds, are really rich in talent. And then there's a massive step off where you're just kind of looking for rotation guys and fillers at that point. Whereas used to, even kind of midway through the 4th round, some drafts deep into the 4th round, you could get some legit guys who might have a chance at some good starter potential pretty quickly. I just don't think that's there anymore. So anyway, point being, once you got to the tail end of the 4th round, which is where the Chiefs were, at 431 with Jared Wiley, TCU tight end, that's just not the same caliber of player as what was sitting there at 95 and 90. It's just not. You look at the guys here, and I'm going to roll over there real quick, so give me just 1 second here. I'm going to go back to the end of the 3rd round. So here's what was available, say, at the end of the 3rd round where Kansas City maybe would have been drafting, say the 90 through 100 era. You got Elijah Jones, CB out of Boston College, Jalen McMillan, wide receiver out of Washington. McMillan was a heck of a prospect. We knew he wasn't going to go early, but still a heck of a prospect. Way better than what you'll find at 133. Same thing for Peyton Wilson, the linebacker out of NC State, who dropped, but still a really legit guy that was available right there. Cam Kitchens, safety out of Miami. You talk about a legit athlete who projects to be a solid starter at the next level. Once you go back to the tail end of the 4th round, it's just not there. So there was a price to pay here that Kansas City did, and even Luke McCaffrey, the wide receiver out of Rice, who went, he was the last pick in the 3rd round. So there was a massive drop-off, and you can see it tail end of 3rd to where the Kansas City Chiefs went in the 4th round, but that's okay. They did something that they wanted to do, and I have zero problem with that. I didn't have any significant problem with anything Kansas City did. And y'all know me, if I've got a problem with it, I'm usually going to run my big mouth and say it. So I didn't have any significant problem with anything they were doing, and I actually liked most of it. So anyway, you pick up the tight end here, Jared Wiley, Texas Christian tight end. I haven't watched a lot of tape of him. Obviously, he's a big guy, like most of the tight ends are. Kansas City just keeps bringing these tight ends in. None of them. Listen, it probably not even Brock Bowers, whom I love, but none of these tight ends is ever going to do anything close to what Kelsey has done for the Chiefs over the past few years. So anytime you draft a tight end, you're either looking for a guy who can block or a guy who can do some of the short catching routes, and that's what Kansas City is going to be doing with Jared Wiley. He's a big guy who can block some, and he's going to be catching a lot of the short underneath stuff, which again is what we thought some of the tight ends in the past for Kansas City were going to be doing. Noah Gray was a guy. I know when people drafted him 3 or 4 years ago, Kansas City did. A lot of people were saying, hey, he maybe can do some of the Kelsey stuff. Forget that. It was never going to happen. It's not going to happen with Wiley. But when you get down here to the end of the 4th round, what you're really looking for is any guy we like because it starts to get real thin real quick. So for Kansas City here to be picking a tight end, he was never really going to go in the top 3 rounds. Wiley really wasn't, but they're just adding to guys that they like here. Safety Jaden Hicks now, Washington State safety. This was a pick that I actually like, and this is a guy who I think may actually see some legit playing time this year because the Chiefs, obviously, with losing, and I'm sorry, the name's completely skipped me here. With the defensive back that they lost this year, creates another hole. Jaden Hicks there from Washington State is a guy who could get conceivably 400, 500 snaps this year, get part of that rotation, and maybe, y'all know I was wanting to get rid of Justin Reed just because of cap reasons. If Hicks, in theory, can step up and play 400 or 500 snaps this year and look good, maybe the year following, then you really can feel good about letting go of Reed and save all that money. That's, I think, $10, $11 million in cap space, and Hicks is there to take the spot. That's always the pipeline, right? Minor League Baseball does the same thing, Major League Baseball. That's always the pipeline. It doesn't always work, but that's the thinking there with Hicks, and I liked Hicks. I thought they got a pretty good pick here considering that they were at the tail end of the 4th round. Hicks was a guy who could have gone higher, probably wasn't going to, but could have. This is a good pick here, just good solid things for Kansas City. You get to the tail end of the 5th round, and it is really, when you get to the tail end of the 5th round, especially in this draft, very top-heavy draft. Lots of rich stuff at the top end. You get to the 5th round, it is thin, buddy. But Hunter Norzad, center out of Penn State, coming on board. He's not going to displace Creed Humphrey, and that's not the plan. But here was a guy who played, I forget, I think he played right tackle for 2 seasons at Cornell, and then he played some guard, and then he played a lot of center here for Penn State. So the idea is, and I really like this. Yeah, thank you, Dan. Jarius Sneed. Sneed is the guy they lost. As if I could forget Sneed. I used to have a lot sharper brain, but I've got 3 kids now, and they each took a piece of my brain with them, and so I'm nowhere near as smart as I used to be, nowhere near as sharp. But Sneed is the guy who was not there, so you needed somebody here. And I will say, because I'm going to mention this later with Kamel Haddon out of Tennessee, Kansas City has shown a remarkable ability the last 3 or 4 seasons to develop these defensive backs. Some of them have been stars, but you go back all the way to Charvarius Ward, really was the first guy, right? 4 or 5 years ago. They turned him into a solid starter and more. Like, he was a legit desired free agent by major teams on the free agent market and is holding up his deal somewhere else now. He didn't just, look good for Kansas City. He looks good on the 49ers as well, and they've done that with several guys since. Sneed was a guy that they developed, and they've got several guys that are on the roster right now that they developed. And so when you see them drafting Jaden Hicks and C.J. Hansen, when you see them doing that, you really feel good, whereas I don't feel great about them developing tackles. I feel great about them developing these defensive backs. But anyway, I was going to say with Hunter Norzad out of Penn State, the center there, he's going to be a backup. I really don't ever see him being a starter, but that's okay. I've always encouraged teams. I think the smarter teams usually draft an average of 1.5 offensive linemen a year. And I'm okay if they draft 2, but that really does seem to be the pipeline because you need so many offensive linemen, and he's never going to displace Creed Humphrey, but that's not the point. You've got a guy here who can play several different positions. You'll let him battle it out in camp. He'll probably make it in camp because you tend to want to keep your more recent draft picks, so he'll probably stay around, and then you can move him around in theory to different places, and you just hope he's a good backup who, if you need him for 4 weeks or 8 weeks, he can hold down the fort. So again, that's the idea there. People like to say that these 5th round draft picks are for depth. They really aren't. I mean, more than likely, he's not going to see any playing time this year, and maybe next year he gets on the field. That really is what's probably going to happen here with the 5th round draft pick. But in theory, hopefully, because he's shown that he can play several different positions, over the next year or 2, you can develop him enough to where when you need a guy for 4 weeks, he can plug in and play, and you're not getting killed. So that's the idea there with Hunter Norzad. I mentioned Kamal Haddon, the CB out of Tennessee. Not a huge defensive back, but that's okay. A lot of these defensive backs here at the back end of the draft weren't. They just were not huge. By the way, Dan, I know you've helped me out a couple of times here. If you got any opinions on the draft, I'll be glad to trot them out here. I know you already mentioned the handicap and the balance, so I know you like it overall. If you got any specific opinions, throw it out here. With Kamal Hadden out of Tennessee, again at this point, you just love the idea that Kansas City grabs up some of these defensive backs because they're so good at developing these guys. They really are. So I love that, picking up a guy out of Tennessee. And then last but not least, the C.J. Hansen out of Holy Cross, the guard pick there. Again, haven't watched a lot of time on Hansen here, a lot of tape on him. But that's 3 offensive linemen Kansas City is pulling in. And I really like that. If somebody else you don't like, if somebody else you like isn't sitting there, then go ahead and start stockpiling some of these position groups where you need several. And that's usually offensive line and the secondary. That really is the 2 groups where you need to have kind of these clusters battling it out, competing in camp for jobs. And you hope the more younger guy makes it, but if he doesn't, hopefully last year's guy actually steps up. So all in all, this isn't the kind of draft that blows you away, but it's also not the kind of draft that leaves you scratching your head. You've stockpiled guys in the offensive line, which I like. You've stockpiled guys in the secondary, which I love because the Chiefs have shown they can develop those secondary guys. You went, hopefully, big speed hookup. And listen, I know what you know and what everybody knows. Just because a guy is fast and just because a guy has top-end speed doesn't mean he's going to translate to a legit NFL receiver. We have seen that time after time after time with these top-end guys that just blow you away with their 40 times. But because you've got Mahomes, who in my opinion has the biggest arm in the NFL, he has the cannon, and we've seen it. Like, there's the legendary story about before he even got drafted about him sitting there with Brett Veach or Andy Reid, I can't remember which. The legendary story about him sitting there and them asking what route he would hit, and he would say, well, the heck with it, I would just hit that deep post route up the middle. And they kind of laughed at him and looked at him like, nobody makes that throw. And he looks back and says, I can make that throw. Well, here we are all these years later, and Patrick has shown us there's no throw on the football field he can't make. You just need to give him a couple of receivers to do it, and he can even win without them. But when you've got that speed guy there, I like that. Certainly gives him a chance. If I'm really going to be picky, I would say I wish they had gotten a second wide receiver in this draft. Not because they need him this year. You've still got Travis Kelce at tight end. You still got Hollywood Brown. You still have Rashee Rice. And then you still have Xavier Worthy. So that's, in theory, that's 4 guys for this year. It's not that you needed a 5th guy this year. But for me, in a draft this rich with wide receivers, I really was hoping they would get 2 of them, not just 1. I was really hoping they would get 2 because when you look at next year's draft, there will be guys in next year's draft. There always are. But this was an unusually rich draft. I mean, just really deep for basically 3 rounds with guys who had the speed and the size or the size. It was all there, and Kansas City just didn't go that route. So there's a part of me that's maybe hoping, wishing that they had taken maybe those 2 4th-rounders, traded back up into late 3rd round and got one of those wide receivers, some of the guys that I mentioned. But they didn't do that. They opted to kind of work their way through it patiently. And listen, when you're Kansas City and you've got the track record of being able to win, then you do whatever you want. You got Mahomes, you got Andy Reid. You already have the advantages heading into any game, any season. So I'm not against anything that they did. That's just me nitpicking as to what my preferences would have been. Was very tickled they got Sua Matea there at tackle. All right, I think that's it. If anybody wants to talk anything else, otherwise draft, hit me up. You can hit me up on the X at BenPark79. If you got stuff you would think about this draft, hit me up there too. I appreciate the folks watching, but I think that's going to be it for the night. We really appreciate it. I'm not sure I even know how to turn this thing off, but unless anybody else has anything else, Dan, I appreciate you watching. There's one other viewer watching as well tonight, so appreciate you doing that. Thank you very much. Give me just a second here. I'll see if I can figure out how to turn this thing off. But, yeah, appreciate it, everybody. Have a great one. Have a good night. Bye.